Hi, welcome to my channel. I'm Julia. I make video essays about films, TV series, and sometimes pop culture. It has been a minute. I haven't uploaded a new video in a while. I've seen quite a few people kept on commenting on older videos as well. I really appreciated that. And so today we're gonna talk about The Crown. This is a long overdue video because I've been wanting to talk about The Crown for quite some time. I actually purposely started watching The Crown even though I knew that I wouldn't enjoy The Crown, because I knew that I was going to make a video on it. And so now that we're finally at the last season, I think it's the perfect timing. It's also the perfect timing because with the first 4 episodes of season 6, I think it's pretty glaring. One of the most striking issues of the show, which is in the difference on how the Al-Fayeds are portrayed, especially when so clearly placed in opposition with white and Western characters in the show. The only non-white, somehow recurring characters that have ever had some weight somehow in the overall story, the Al-Fayeds are portrayed as either exploitative, cruel, and uncaring, or stupid, weak, and incompetent. It's funny here how much emphasis is placed on showcasing the obvious privilege that Dodi has thanks to his father's wealth.
They have talent and expertise. What do you have?
Money.
لا وحياة أمك. I have money. What do you have?
That's not fair. I have ideas, I have instincts, and I have a right.
Yet the same magnifying glass is not applying to the main characters of the show, which are literally part of one of the most powerful families in the whole world, and the show is supposedly about them. But their privilege is always framed as an obligation, which they stoically carry on with. More on this later. The storytelling dedicated to the Al-Fayeds in season 6 is completely driven to such an excess into portraying them as manipulative, coercive, and completely devoid of moral compass, focused exclusively on their goal to climb the social ladder.
If the Fayed family is seen as good enough for the former wife of the next king and the mother of the king after that, then how can the government reasonably deny him the British citizenship he is so actively seeking?
Gaining the approval from influential white people and achieving a Western lifestyle seem to be their primary objective.
British society is the finest in the world. British manners and customs rule the world. With your help, I will become that rare thing, a British gentleman,
Leading the characters and the show itself to fetishize and glorify whiteness. And subsequently, that's the message that the audience implicitly receives and makes its own. And that's why it's extremely problematic to encode these sort of messages in media text, because it perpetuates depictions of Muslim men as deviant, uncivilized, and deceitful. A narrative historically employed by the British Empire to validate the subjugation of people of color. These portrayals continue to support the dehumanization of entire groups of people, while reinforcing the self-interest concept that the West is the epitome of civilization and decency. In contrast, the royal family, and particularly Charles, are portrayed as deeply human, with complex but fundamentally good emotional realities. Despite for years the general public has called out the royal family's treatment of Diana, the last season of The Crown rewrites history. It employs a series of tactics, narrative and framing tactics, which The Crown has used since the very first season. So let's dig a little deeper. What's important to note here is that the show uses 2 main ways to further this narrative. First, by presenting real, factual events, and then adding on it with fake or unsubstantiated claims. For example, Mario Brenna was indeed the one that took the famous shot of Dodi and Diana kissing on the yacht, but he wasn't hired by Mohammed Al-Fayed to do so. In fact, he did comment on how this plotline is absurd and completely invented. And you can see how it can make a huge difference to add that in, because it further supports the opportunistic characterization of Mohammed. Just like there is no evidence whatsoever to support the idea that Diana was either forced or tricked in any way into going to Paris, or that Dodi proposed to her while in France. And two, by blurring the lines between what is factual and how it was felt and or discussed by the characters. Now, obviously, none of us are inside Buckingham Palace, none of us knew personally Diana or anyone else of the royal family, so the show has to imagine feelings and conversations. But this is where not only the script, but the overall choices in what and how to emphasize, and by whom, showcases a lot of bias, and does so in a way that really helps into shifting or moving perceptions of real figures or real historical facts. This is in a way very similar into how the audience typically believes documentaries to be completely factual, whether that may not be necessarily the case. I made a video about this. If you are curious, go and check it out. So it's interesting to know towards whom the show uses these tactics for and to whom it uses them against. Practically in a parallel way to Diana and Dodi's love story, we see Charles and Camilla now living their life together in the open. Yet Camilla's intentions here are imagined completely differently than what the show imagines for Dodi. She's afforded a kind and graceful portrayal.
Public gesture of approval from the Queen would transform the campaign for Camilla's legitimacy. Everything else is just window dressing, frankly.
It's fine. It'll happen in its own time.
Diana and I have been divorced for a year, separated for 5. The time, darling, is now.
Oh, come on, it's not that bad.
I agree. If we had briefed that the Queen would be attending, it would be a humiliating climb down, but we didn't.
I'm sure she'll come round eventually. At least one hopes she will. I'm happy to wait.
If we were to apply the same liberties that the show took into its depiction of Dodi, we could have imagined Camilla being negative, coercive, manipulative into being publicly recognized by the Queen, or scheming to be accepted by the royal family, or envious of the hold that Diana still had on the general public. Not only this obviously doesn't happen in The Crown, but the show goes a long way into utilizing the add-on tactics mentioned before, but this time through a favorable lens. So, for example, Prince Charles really did throw a party for Camilla's 50th birthday, but he never did read a moving excerpt from Jane Austen's Persuasion at the event. Even more, in such a convoluted effort to make the audience sympathize with the royal family and to somehow implicitly blame Diana's death on the Al-Fayyeds, the show also ended up completely stripping Diana of her own agency. The Crown does that by nodding at the enduring media narrative that Diana was lost, susceptible, vulnerable, and ultimately became a casualty of her own wild lifestyle.
Diana's behavior is becoming more and more erratic. More and more reckless. More and more out of control.
The Crown builds this characterization in previous episodes by deciding, for example, to show Diana as paranoid for believing her phone had been wiretapped. We spend a few episodes before the car crash looking at a defeated Diana, wanting to go home to her children but aimlessly agreeing with and following around Dodi to Paris. By all means, Diana struggled to exit the monarchy and become a freer, more adult version of herself. Dodi Al-Fayyed was her choice during that period, her free choice during that transition. And yet the show flips that by portraying her yet again as lost and vulnerable and someone that her partner is taking advantage of. And this really rubs me the wrong way because it does take away on what she shows for herself. Fundamentally, her entire agency, which she fought so much for to be able to acquire again. The Crown furthers this narrative even visually. The scenes of Dodi and his father entrapping Diana coincides with scenes of young William hunting his first stag. This juxtaposition hints at Diana being pursued and surrounded by the Al-Fayyeds, similar to the stag being hunted. While William engages in a traditional rite of passage, the Fayyeds' hunt depicts them as savage, dehumanizing Diana and presenting treating her as their conquest. In just 4 episodes, The Crown uses juxtaposition so often in order to heighten the credibility of its chosen narrative and further the subtext it wants so strongly to communicate. In another example, we're getting an entire episode driven by 2 very different photographers, as though they are representative of the 2 sides of the conflict. The photographer that Al Fayed hires is a sleazy Italian, yes, I do take offense, opportunist paparazzo, and his monologue even features coded words like hunting and killing.
Love it to be like hunters, killers.
While the photographer hired by the royal family for the portrait of Charles and his children is a timid, married, tweed-wearing Brit that just loves the Queen so much.
My wife sometimes jokes that I love the Queen more than her. Well, I do love the Queen.
Following Diana's death, the show largely glosses over the intense public backlash all the royals, but particularly the Queen, faced during that time, reframing it as a need that the population had to feel close to the rest of the royal family. So the Queen is not cold and heartless. Her decision to not address Diana's death in the following days wasn't because she didn't want to, but according to The Crown, is because that was what she had to do in her role.
It's natural for people to come together and express their grief. But the Crown rises above impulse.
Oftentimes, when the show has to address, at least partially, at least in some ways, some very well-known faux pas or scandals on the monarchy's side, it very, very often justifies the reactions or behaviors by the main characters wanting to, but in no position to do so, either because they need to remain impartial or objective or whatever else.
Will you forgive me?
If you deny me the man I love,
If I put duty before family?
would you forgive anyone who denied you, Philip?
It doesn't compare.
Well, it compares exactly.
In marrying Philip, I wasn't violating the scriptures or offending the church.
This really helps into shifting the potential blame in what is typically perceived as a bad behavior into somehow a graceful one that even weighs heavily on the person to begin with.
You must also mourn someone else, Elizabeth Mountbatten, for she has now been replaced by another person, Elizabeth Regina. The 2 Elizabeths will frequently be in conflict with one another. The fact is, the Crown must win. Must always win.
While supporting the gravitas developed through this self-importance recognition of the monarchy, which almost becomes a character in its own right.
Monarchy is something you are, not what you do. The crown is a symbol of permanence, of stability, of continuity. If you step down, you will be symbolizing instability and impermanence. You'll also be indicating the luxury of choice, which is the one thing we cannot have if we claim the crown is also our birthright.
The Crown utilizes this tactic all over again, even subtly. For example, when Charles tries to summarize the effect Diana had on people, the passive viewer may see this scene as a testament of Charles's recognition of Diana's impact. But he does get it entirely backwards when he says that her gift was to show people that great pain and sadness don't discriminate and that it comes to those with beauty and privilege too. That's how the show frames the royal struggles. That was not something that Diana ever really communicated. If anything, her gift was the ability to elevate and embrace with dignity every person she encountered, regardless of their class or social status. Something that made, in comparison, perceive the other royals at the time as cold and detached. But the show does this so often, especially to reshape the perception of royal characters. It did so with Charles, especially in season season 5, where his character could have been more under pressure given the undoubtedly negative treatment he had for Diana.
Can't be much fun being the Prince of Wales if you're an impressive man.
Is he?
Oh, yes, with energy and a brain and a conscience and a beating heart and a genuine desire to engage and make a difference.
The Crown counters that by focusing on Charles's charisma and progressive thinking, which is yet again stifled and trapped by the limitations of the monarchy.
Every day I meet people from all walks of life, men and women my age, who've gone out into the world and made their mark. It's precisely the thing that I'm not allowed to do. What am I? I'm just a useless ornament stuck in a waiting room, gathering dust.
The show is actually so focused on reframing characters that doesn't even realize how incredibly out of touch it ends up being sometimes. In season 5, Charles ends up breakdancing with an underprivileged group of POCs as part of his Prince Charles's charity and ends up saying to them that he understands what it's like to be criticized and judged.
And you may think that someone of my age and background wouldn't understand young people in your communities and the unfair judgment of society that you sometimes face. Well, as it happens, I do understand a little bit about what it is to be criticized and judged.
As the show evolved, it increasingly leaned towards a more humanistic approach in portraying the royal subjects. This has led to an over-romanticization of said characters and a polite sidestepping of their most unfavorable actions. For example, people believe that the second season was particularly critical of the royals because it does show the difficulties and frailties of Elizabeth's and Philip's marriage. But this is also the season, together with the first one, where so much more could have been said about Britain's hold on former and current colonies. What do you think would have been better perceived, and what do you think is more relatable, to see the issues in a marriage for the royal family or to highlight the brutality of colonizers? By framing the story as a family drama instead, political considerations are left to the sidelines. They are there, but they are literally intruding on the happy couple.
You'll be letting down anyway. A koala? This whole thing is a circus. It's a miserable circus. Trudging from town to town with the dancing bears.
While acknowledging that the Queen and the family did face and continue to face incessant scrutiny as well as internal struggles like any family would, the series definitely overlooks their involvement in maintaining a global system of oppression. The Crown takes this humanistic approach as an excuse to avoid portrayal of complex historical facts. It humanizes its characters, and even when by doing so it depicts a personal flaw, it always somehow ends up to balance that out. For example, just as soon as we start to dislike Philip because he's a cheater and he's just generally very arrogant, he refuses to continue his voyage until a stranded fisherman isn't saved and returned to his family.
I have never abused my privileges and I don't intend to start now, but this is the royal yacht. I am on it representing the Crown, and I say turn it around and take this man home.
So let's not talk too much about the British Empire. Let's focus on who they are as people. Let's counterbalance the personal flaws that we highlighted when we focused on them as people. And especially let's do so with something that the audience can go, "Aw," to.
Then we went out of our way to return him to his home, his family, and his people.
Princess Elizabeth's visit to Kenya in 1952 during British Dominion is presented in an overtly romanticized light, depicting Kenyans as adoring admirers of the royals. All of this without a single line of script ever spoken by a POC. Yet the Mau Mau rebellion was forming at the very same time. The series also doesn't address the incredible turmoil left behind in India post-independence as a consequence of the partition imposed by the imperialists, and it spends a considerable amount of time instead on Winston Churchill, the person, practically glorifying his memory, not touching in the slightest on how his policies heavily contribute to the death of 3 million people in India during the Bengal famine.
You were the compass that steered and directed me. Not just me, all of us. Where would Great Britain be without its greatest Britain?
At the center of it all, the main issue surrounding the crown stems from the stark contrast between its meticulously detailed naturalism in costumes, staging, set design, and the liberties it takes instead with plot lines. This narrow focus does a disservice to the area, failing also to acknowledge the significant societal changes occurring within Britain, because the portrayal of post-war Britain engages only the perspective of the sovereign and those within that circle. While Princess Elizabeth was about to get married, ordinary Britons were actively reshaping society by championing socialist ideals and establishing the welfare state. The Crown presents historical facts as a grand spectacle overseen by the wealthy, the privileged, and the titled, and it makes a huge effort to depict them with decency, wisdom, and grace. Everyone else is irrelevant, and everything should only be seen, understood, and empathized with through their eyes. Again, this distortion does pass through your screen fairly commonly, with scenes that will want you to focus on said decency, wisdom, and grace, but most of the time end up being completely tone deaf. A lot of people rightfully found it odd that Diana would appear as a ghost and would do so only towards Charles and the Queen. The incredibly odd shift to sci-fi aside, would it make more sense for Diana to appear to her own children? After all, you just spent 4 episodes drilling me about how Diana was forced to go to Paris and only wanted to come back home to see her children. But Peter Morgan said, hey, this isn't the real Diana's ghost, but an externalization of Charles and the Queen's grief for Diana. That's worse. How can you not see that that's worse? You know what is worse? Because it basically means that both Charles and the Queen immediately after Diana's death exempt themselves of their own faults and responsibilities.
The only thought I've had since the moment I heard is regret.
That will pass.
And practically tell themselves how handsome they are and what fantastic job they're doing as Queen.
Thank you for how you were in the hospital. So raw, broken, and handsome.
Hey, we are in the end screen. Okay, so this was the problematic elements of The Crown. Let me know what you thought of this video. I really do appreciate the feedback. Were there other problematic elements that you thought of that were mentioned in this video? Also, let me know what you would like to see next. There are a lot of videos in the pipeline. Thank you for watching and see you next time.